Everyone, I'm really excited to be here with Tiffany for an interview about schizoaffective disorder. So the first question is, you've had some very early in life experiences with hallucinations and delusions. Would you be willing to share a little bit about what that was like and how you kind of understood these experiences when they first started happening?
Yeah, when I was about 4, I had, a pretty common fantasy for little kids. I first of all, I thought I wasn't human. I knew I wasn't human. And what I thought at that time was that I was a fairy, and I came to Earth to learn about it so I could go back and tell my people about it after I died. And that's how I would get home. This has since evolved into, um, not being a fairy so much as an alien from another planet. And my main voice, April, she's my sister from that planet. Um, and I came here to look for our mother. And so when I die, I'll get to go back and be reunited with my sister April. But at the time, being a young kid, I didn't really have any concept of aliens or anything at 4 years old. So what I did know was fairies. And so I thought I was a fairy. And that was, from what I can recall, my earliest delusion. And then there started growing more when I was about 5 or 6. I knew that there were invisible and hidden cameras recording me 24/7 for a TV show. And that TV show, and you probably won't know who this was, Phil Donahue was one of the first talk show hosts for that reality talk show, kind of like Oprah, but he was one of the first. And so he had a reality show like Oprah did, and or a talk show. And so I thought that there was a secret TV channel that I could not find and I wasn't supposed to find. And that he would project what they were recording, my life, on a screen, and he would make comments on it that I could hear. And then people in the audience would also make comments. And so on rare occasions, I've actually had just kind of the whole screen in front of me, like my whole field of vision becomes that studio, and I can see them watching me and making comments about it. So when I was very small, um, I thought that, there were cameras hidden inside, and then when I went outside, there were invisible flying cameras, which we would now think of as drones. But of course, when I was 5 or 6, those didn't exist. So I find that very interesting. That I kind of saw the future before, except of course our drones aren't invisible yet. Uh, yeah, so I had quite a few. Um, Delusions. Those are my main symptoms, or delusions. And the key around these delusions was that I knew secrets that I wasn't supposed to tell. I wasn't supposed to know I was really a fairy. I wasn't supposed to know there was a secret TV show about me. So I never told anyone. I kept all of them a secret because I was afraid if they, whoever they are, found out that I knew, then I would be punished. Um, so I never told anyone. And so those were my earliest experiences. I think I had some hallucinations when I was very young, mostly at night, kind of hypnagogic type experiences. Um, but really consistently, I didn't have my first hallucination until I was around 8 years old, and there was a hill on the school playground that I befriended. He started talking to me and I befriended him. And so me and the two other friends I had would go hang out at this hill. Um, and I would talk to him and just have a relationship with this little hill. And then when I was 12, finally the girls came, and that was a very consistent voices from very specific entities with their own personalities and such.
Thank you so much for your answer and for describing this so vividly. And it is fascinating, I guess, how I guess like the essentially invisible drones that at the time were maybe purely a trait of delusions now in some ways become to an extent reality. I guess the question related to that is, how did these experiences cause you to feel initially? I mean, I would imagine that they were probably distressing, but about
You know, at that age, I thought the people who were watching the TV show and stuff really liked me. So it was actually not a bad thing. It was a little paranoia inducing to be followed every day, all day. And that delusion still is with me to this day. I believe that all the time. There are cameras everywhere recording me. Um, but being a fairy, for a 4-year-old, heck, that's fantastic. Um, the people on the TV show liked me. I had a belief that Sting, although I did not know who he was at the time, I just knew the song on the radio, Every Breath You Take, came out when I was about 6. And I thought that Sting had met me as an adult woman, fallen in love with me, didn't want anyone to know. So he went back in time to when I was a child and wrote that song about me so that no one would know it was about me. So those delusions were actually kind of made me feel good, but very isolated too, because I couldn't tell anyone all these things that were going on in my mind. So I was a very isolated child. I was not one to initiate a lot of play with other people, and I just wanted to be off in my own little world.
yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for that explanation. The next question is, I guess, sort of a direct follow up to that, but you've you've gone a long time without access to a diagnosis. Would you be willing to describe what that experience was like and what it was like to grow up and go through school without medication or uh,
Yeah, that was hard, especially in high school when you've got the hormones and everything. You're a teenager, and 14 was when I believe I had my first schizophrenic and depressive episode. Then again at 18, 34, and then again a few years ago, um, 4 years now. Um, so being a teenager and going through all of that was extremely difficult. Um, I will say that I have horrible long-term memory. So the only way I really know what happened was because I kept a journal back then. And so I can read through my journal, and it talks about people following me. It talks about kids' faces melting in the middle of class, things like that, where it was extremely distressing. I had monsters reaching out and grabbing me and clawing me. So I don't like being touched suddenly. um, so it was extremely distressing. And while I was known as the crazy girl in high school, um, they didn't really know what was wrong with me because we wouldn't tell adults because, it was the teenager sacred don't tell adults code thing. Um, so I was just known as the crazy girl, and I didn't really know what was wrong with me. I did write a paper on schizophrenia. I wrote about that, researching schizophrenia and stuff, but it didn't exactly click. And I think that was probably just because well, 14, I was 14, but also that I had a lack of insight. And I think that really hindered my understanding and seeing myself in those descriptions of symptoms. So yeah, it was really hard to get through, um, and it ended up landing me in the hospital at 18, where I got my first diagnosis, which would turn out to be a misdiagnosis, which was major depression with psychotic features, because the shrink at the time he said he was looking at depression with psychotic features, schizoaffective or schizophrenia. And as I was 18 and I was in college at the time, he said that he was going to go with depression because it would give me a better shot at life. But that also meant that I was told I could eventually go off antipsychotics, which I eventually did, and then ended up with a 15-year period of being unmedicated, um, and which led to my third episode. So, yeah.
Oh, that's yeah, I can see where not having the correct diagnosis must have led to a lot of challenges. And if you're comfortable, would you be willing to share what it was like when you finally did receive the correct diagnosis? And I guess like during the times where you had a good medication, and did the diagnosis kind of come as a surprise for you, or was it a relief or something else?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the last time I had really looked at schizophrenia was when I was 14, and, so by then, this was when I was 34 when I had my 3rd episode, and my husband I had a husband, well, I still have a husband, but, I hadn't told him about the psychosis. He knew about depression, and I was medicated for depression, um, but I didn't tell him about the psychosis because I thought it was over. I thought it was done. It had been 15 years since I'd had an episode. Um, and so when I started having psychotic breaks again, he was like, okay, we got to go see a shrink. Well, I was very anti medication at the point because when I was 18, they over medicated me on Risperdal. And so I said, never again. So at first, we went to a therapist because I was like, I'm not taking any antipsychotics. I don't want the medication. And she saw me several times and she finally was like, sweetie, there's just nothing I can do for you. You've got to have medication. And she kind of convinced me to give it another shot and referred me to the best shrink I've ever had. Um, I went and I took pages typed up from my journal of what I had been through when I was 14 and 18 and recently because I started writing again when I went into an episode. Hypergraphia is a common symptom for schizophrenics. And so I took her all these notes and stuff. Um, and she was able to diagnose me with well, she had a time where she saw all my stuff and read it before I got there. So when I got there, she was ready with the diagnosis, which is very not common. You do not get a diagnosis that fast usually, but then you also don't have the history that I had usually. Um, so she said, you have paranoid schizophrenia. And it's kind of like now it just takes your breath away. Um, and I felt overwhelming shame. I just felt like, "Oh, great. I'm broken forever. This is not something that happened to me when I was 18 and 14 and will never happen again. No, this is a forever thing." And I felt broken and I felt ashamed and it was a really hard diagnosis to get. And it was really good that I had the support of my husband and my shrink and my therapist because it is such a hard diagnosis to get.
Huh. I can imagine that it would be so challenging, and I'm really sorry that you had to go through feeling, I guess, that amount of shame and brokenness with the initial diagnosis. Um, the next question is actually it's a little bit of a jump in topic. It's still related to diagnoses, but would you be willing to discuss a bit about how a diagnosis of schizoaffective can make it more challenging to access other diagnoses, and what your experience has been like with this?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, recently there's been an explosion of new information about women and autism and women and ADHD. And so I was reading up on those things because I read a study when I was researching schizophrenia that said that schizophrenia, autism, and ADHD are all highly comorbid. So I started reading about it and, pervasive autonomy, autism, having trouble making friends and things, having special interests like animals and reading for me, inattentive ADHD, although that's a really hard one because it could be that I'm just thinking about my delusions that has nothing to do with ADHD, or it could be that I'm inattentive, but I'm focusing on my delusions. So it's very difficult for people. as I've been told, for psychiatrists, psychologists, to untangle that web of what's schizoaffective, what's autism, and what's ADHD once you have that schizoaffective diagnosis. I know on Reddit there are a lot of people with schizophrenia who were diagnosed as children with autism and or ADHD, and that seems to work out well. But when I have reached out to autistic and ADHD assessors and I explain that I have this schizoaffective diagnosis, they're not willing to meet with me. They're not willing to assess me because it's too hard to try and decide what's autism, what's ADHD, and what's schizoaffective, which I understand logically, but it is not very helpful for me because I like to have my diagnoses. I like to know things. I like to compartmentalize. I'm a librarian. I compartmentalize. I categorize. I catalog. So it's very frustrating to me. So I kind of sometimes self-identify as autistic and ADHD, but I guess I'll never really know.
Yeah, personally, I think that self-identification is pretty accurate, especially when someone's done as much research into a topic as you undoubtedly have. But I hope that there's more research done in this area in the future, because I can imagine it's disheartening to, yeah, not be able to access an assessment. And then I think you touched on this a bit, but would you be willing to share, again, to whatever extent you're comfortable, a little bit about the four major episodes that you've had and whether there were any kind of common themes or similarities through these episodes?
Yeah, yeah, there's some common themes, definitely. The being watched all the time, very common. I also feel like windows are a big issue because people can see through them and I can't see them unless it's nighttime, in which case I can see them, which made it really hard in the psych ward at night because there were all these windows. And I knew that when the lights were on inside, outside people could see inside, and it made me super paranoid. Um, but during my 4 episodes, all right, 14, 18, 34, and, 41. Um, 42? Something like that. Anyway, um, yeah, most of my, I have and I use terminology that isn't typically used. I have what I think of as my everyday schizophrenia. Um, that's just mostly delusions all day, every day, just vying for my attention in my head. And then that's normal for me on medication, doing well right now. It's all over the place in here. Um, so that's just normal. Racing thoughts all the time, no big deal. When I go into what I call a schizophrenic episode, a depressive episode, that's a long chunk of time, generally a year. This last time it was 3 years, um, where I have increased delusions. I generally get the mean voices. The depression and the psychosis like to attack together. So the voices become mean and say nasty, nasty things pretty constantly. And, uh, and so I'm in a pretty precarious state. And in those episodes, I have what are called psychotic breaks. And those are very short, like 1 to 4 hours long. And that's when I am completely incoherent. I speak gibberish. I cannot speak English anymore. Um, and I am hallucinating constantly, both visually and auditorially. Um, and I have delusions just going on all the time, and I'm more likely to speak out about those during a psychotic break. And then after a psychotic break, I generally sleep about 12 to 14 hours, and it's what I call my reset time. Um, so that's what these episodes are for me. So when I was 14, the episodes were my delusions were very much persecutory. Um, and um, and that's a pretty common theme, the being watched, the persecutory. But then, as I talked about earlier, that I'm an alien. One common theme through all my episodes is that I am being um, hunted by aliens um, who are searching for me to destroy me before I can get back to my alien sister April and we can find our mother. Um, they they are searching the universe for me, and sometimes they get very close. And when they get very close, the crows and the ravens warn me, and the wind warns me, and and it's coming up soon. Daffodils are portals for the evil entities to get to me. So early spring is a really big trigger for me, seeing daffodils all over the place because they're a big flower here in Oklahoma. Um, so that's always fun. I just have to kind of reorient myself. Okay. Um, so that's a big one. Also, being trapped by the Lord of Madness is a pretty common theme. He traps people who are insane on his own planet. He lures them with bright colors and beautiful flowers and beautiful scenery. And then when you get there, you're imprisoned and it's all black and white and it's dull and it's horrible. And he just keeps you trapped there, insane, in perpetuity. And the only way I've ever escaped is through my sister April, who has helped me escape from him a few times now. So those are my pretty big themes um, for those episodes.
Thank you so much for explaining those and the common themes. And yeah, I hope that the early spring period goes um, smoothly this year. It's always tricky when there's triggers that are so far outside of our control or that are episodic. The kind of other question is um, on so yeah, I appreciate you explaining the common themes, and I'm also curious about the differences between episodes. So were any of them easier or more challenging to get through? And if so, what do you think contributed to them being easier or challenging?
Wow. They were each challenging in their own way. When I was 14 and 18, especially 14, not having any support. When I was 18 and I started having episodes at college, my roommate and my friends at college were very helpful and very supportive. And then, of course, these last two episodes, I've had my husband and my family and stuff who have been very supportive. So that's been very helpful. Going through that first episode at 14 without any knowledge or support or anything, I'm really not sure how I did that. Um, so I generally think of that as my worst one. Um, but gee, they're all pretty bad. It's come down to, from what I figured out lately, is that, my antipsychotic is pretty stable, but my Prozac, my antidepressant, every 10 years or so, it'll just stop working. And I have not found another antidepressant that will work for me. So it's been a year now since I got over my last episode, but my last episode was for 3 years because we couldn't find another medication in the Prozac. I had to wait and wait until it reset and it was would work for me again. Um, so each episode, it's a depression and a psychosis just going together and attacking together. So that in itself is a pretty big challenge to have to deal with both of them at the same time. And then just my general anxiety, social anxiety, awkwardness. Um, so yeah, I think they each had kind of their own unique issues, especially because of where I was in life. Really difficult at the beginning when you're trying to start life and you're trying to extricate yourself from your parents and to have to go back home for a semester, um, was pretty devastating. But yeah, I think I learned a lot the first 3 episodes, so maybe this 4th episode wasn't quite as bad, although it did last longer than any others, so they all want that top spot for being worst.
I'm sorry that they're all competing for the top or competing to be challenging in different ways. That's hopefully the next one will compete in the opposite direction or won't ever come. Um, yeah. And the next question is, and I think you've already explained this in a really insightful way, but is there anything else that you'd like to share about what it's like to have delusions as a main symptom? So, like the sub questions I have under this is, in what ways are delusions easier to keep hidden compared to other symptoms? And is it ever challenging to have symptoms that are easier to keep hidden and that like maybe it places more of the onus or choice of describing it on you?
Yeah, yeah, it is a lot easier to keep delusions hidden than voices. Um, the the desire to respond to someone saying, "Hey, hey, 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 hey," it's overwhelming. I mean, people with toddlers probably get it. Eventually, you're going to answer the voice that just keeps poking you. So it's really hard not to yell at the voices, especially when they're being super mean. Um, I find sometimes just plugging my ears real quick kind of helps um, for a second, gives you a little reprieve. Um, but yeah, delusions are definitely easier to keep. That being said, the exception might be paranoid delusions. I know a lot of people with schizophrenia um, have paranoid delusions that they are very vocal about. The CIA is following me. I'm being gang stalked, things like that. And that is really hard to keep to yourself. Um, and I always had a good sense since I was very young. I always kind of knew what crazy talk was. And I always knew that I didn't want to talk like a crazy person. So I have a very good filter on what I should and should not say to people, unless I'm in a psychotic break. Then all bets are off. But daily, I'm pretty good at keeping things to myself. And so, yeah, it is difficult to know whether or not to choose, um, especially those paranoid ones. My coworkers are monitoring me through Teams. I really hate Teams. Um, things like that, and I have to keep it to myself. I can't go out there and start yelling at my coworkers. This is not gonna end well. Um, so I have to keep it to myself, and moreover, I also have to remind myself that this is probably not true. I have a really hard time, reality checking my delusions, but I'll go so far as probably not true.
Yeah. I love the idea of assigning probabilities to things. Yeah, and kind of the part you mentioned about your coworkers is actually perfect for the next question because I'd love to hear more about your experience working in the field of library and information studies. I think it's just a really neat field. And kind of the first question under that is, in our pre-interview, you mentioned that you came out as schizoaffective right before COVID. What was that experience like?
Yeah, that was really interesting. Okay, so I got my diagnosis at 34, and right before COVID, oh heck, man, I would have been in my 40s. Right before, it really was right before my last episode, which turned out to be great because they knew what was happening. um, when I tried to quit my job, my boss was actually like, hey, I know someone with bipolar, and I think you really need to stop and think about this. And I think we're going to put you on FMLA, and we're going to revisit this quitting your job thing later, which was heaven sent, because no, that is not what I wanted to do. That was a psychotic break, and I had no idea what I was doing or saying, and I was, you know, being psychotic. Um, so that was really helpful. They really most of my coworkers have been extremely supportive. If they haven't been, then I don't know about it because they haven't been rude about it or anything like that. No snide comments, no, passive aggressive remarks or anything like that. They've been very good, and I've been pretty open about it too since then. I know one coworker has a daughter who's schizoaffective, another coworker has a sister who's schizophrenic. So um, there are a lot more of us out there than you might think.
That's awesome. And what are some accommodations that you've had at work that have been beneficial?
Whoops, which way do I go? Okay, you
That
see
way's
that
perfect. I
teal
see.
behind me? That's a curtain. You can see that there are blinds, but the blinds weren't good enough because I could see people's shadows. So they went ahead and got me curtains. Let me just order it through Amazon, which was really nice because I was kind of having executive function disorder. Um, because I've been here for 18 years. So most of the time, this has just been blinds, but it's always bothered me. But before, when I hadn't come out yet, how are you going to explain that? I want curtains. Yeah, okay. You want fancy frilly curtains? Buy them yourself, weirdo. But so after they knew about my diagnosis, and then I mentioned one day that somebody was bothering me because their shadow kept being there. Um, my boss was like, "Let's get you some curtains," and once she said that, it really kind of made the impetus for me to do it. I mean, I could have bought my own curtains. They were like 13 bucks, but it was kind of an executive functioning to get the curtains at home, to get them here, to put them up. It seemed like a whole ordeal. But when she said, "Let us order you the curtains and they'll come right to your office and we'll help you put them up," and all of a sudden it was something I could do. What a lot of people don't know is schizophrenia not only has delusions and hallucinations, but we also have loss of pleasure, lack of motivation, a lot of cognitive issues like my poor long-term memory, a lot of attention deficit issues, things like that. So that executive functioning, for them to be able to help me with that is extremely helpful. Um, and they can do that just by kind of giving me a little bit more time, or maybe sometimes even poking me and pushing me a little bit, especially with that ADHD I might have. Um, that sometimes a little poke, poke, you need to get this done today or tomorrow really helps. So they've been very supportive and helpful to me.
Wonderful. And then if you could design kind of an ideal world that has unlimited resources, what kind of accommodations do you think might be helpful in this hypothetical utopia?
What I really want is a room that's soundproof so I can go yell at the voices when they're super mean and I just can't take it anymore. Um, we have a quiet room here in the library, but I think that's supposed to be quiet. No yelling at the voices. so, so I would really love a little pod where I could just go in there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, and then kind of a jump in topic, but if you could travel back in time and tell yourself, so a younger version of yourself at I guess whatever age you pick, anything about schizoaffective, what would you tell yourself? And or is there anything that you just wish in general that you'd known earlier on in life?
Wow. I'm not sure if I would have told 14-year-old me to go get help, to tell a parent, to tell an adult, because of what I went through when I was 18, the over medication, um, the shrinks who wouldn't talk to me, but only my parents, even though I was 18. HIPAA was just a new thing back then. Um, I was very poorly treated when I was 18, and I don't think it would have been any better when I was 14. So I don't know that I would have told myself that, but I would have just told myself that I would have told myself I was going to live. I didn't expect to be 47 years old. I never expected to be that. I think it would have been really helpful to hear. You're going to make it, sweetie.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. And I guess it is unfortunately the case that sometimes there's just no good solution in the moment, but having that long-term hope can mean so much.
Yeah.
And then the last question Is there anything else that you'd like to add that I haven't asked about?
I've talked a lot about bad things that happen, but it's not all bad. I told you about being a fairy made me very happy. The people liked me who were recording me. Um, that fluctuates depending on my depression levels. Sometimes they hate me, but when I was 5 or 6, they loved me. Um, but also things like not all of the voices are bad. The girls, they came to me when I was 12 years old. I had no friends, and they were my middle school support system. And they were wonderful, and I loved each and every one of them. But April took them away when I was 14, and it was just her and me. And then I descended into my psychotic episode. Um, but they were wonderful people. I miss them every day. The only one I get to talk to anymore is April, and she's really spotty with the medication. I have to be really stressed out for her to come out. Um, but also, like, one day I was sitting there waiting in the waiting room of my therapist's office, and there in the floorboards was a little pink platypus. And he said, "Why are you so sad?" And I said, "I don't know." And so he climbed up into my head and he helped me keep the depression at bay for a time. Um, and then he went away, I guess, probably with medication. But I like to think that he went and found somebody else who was depressed and needed him and went and helped them. And he's just traveling around the world helping depressed people. So it's
If you-
not all bad.
Yeah, I love the idea of a kind of an anti-depression emotional support pink platypus. It's just, and I also really appreciate you highlighting, I guess, some of the positives, especially because I think those are under discussed a lot. But yeah, thank you so much again for your time and experiences, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.